So, last we left off, we were talking about Saul, King Saul. He wasn't always king. Um, he was just like a guy, and then Samuel and God made him king. He had doubters, people who didn't think he could do it, but he proved them wrong and was very successful in battle. And he was a very successful king for a long time. And it seemed like maybe everything was going to be okay. That Israel would unite under a king who was faithful to God, and everything was going to be good. But then, as we saw last week, even though Saul was king for a while and things were going good, at some point he got impatient and he committed an act that was only allowed of priests and not of kings. So he disobeyed Samuel, but more importantly, he disobeyed God. And if that wasn't bad enough, later in a story that we're skipping, Saul defeats the Amalekites. But instead of completely eradicating them as God commanded, he allowed their king to live and basically looted their town, which God had specifically instructed him not to do. So it's becoming very clear that as king, Saul does what he wants and not what God wants. So he's kind of reached this point where he's like, I'm king because I'm awesome, not I'm king because God's awesome, which is what God would want from a king, is not, to be self-important, that God is still ultimately the true king of Israel, right? So, God's like, this is no good. We must find a new king. But this is easier said than done. For Israel has a king, Saul. So even if God has decided that Saul isn't to be king anymore, the people still like Saul as their king. They aren't ready for a new king. So anyone who was identified as a new king would have to be extraordinary in order for people to accept him, but would also have a very difficult road ahead of them, fighting against Saul and his followers. So this is not going to be an easy transition of power. So one would think that in light of this, God would choose a great general, someone who is even more tall and mighty than Saul. But as we often see, God doesn't think along the same lines that we do. So, 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 5. 1 Samuel 16, 1 through 5. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I shall name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" He said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to sacrifice. So Samuel is very upset over this whole Saul disaster. Sure, Samuel in the beginning opposed Israel having a king at all. But once God chose Saul, Samuel put his whole support behind him. Samuel invested in him. He guided him. He leaded him. He's been like a spiritual leader and nurturer to him. And it's been a long time. It's been years, probably like 20 years. So to see Saul turn away from God again and again, well, it's very difficult for him. But here God is like, "Samuel, it is time to get out of your funk. We have to have a new king. We have to find a new king. I need you to do this." Samuel is hesitant because if Saul knows Samuel is out looking for a new king, if the current king knows you're looking for a new king, he's not going to allow it. So if Saul knows, he'll kill Samuel. But God gives Samuel a plan, saying that he should take a cow with him and then say he's going to sacrifice it. And invite this dude named Jesse, who lives in Bethlehem, which is where he's going. And then from Jesse's family, God will show Samuel which of his sons is meant to be king. Okay, so we have a plan. So Samuel does as God instructs him. He goes to the town, and the townspeople are worried. Worried that Samuel might start something and bring Saul's attention there, which they don't want. But Samuel tells them he's just there for a sacrifice, and they are relieved. Samuel invites Jesse and all of his sons to this sacrifice. One of Jesse's sons will be the new king. Which one? It's a mystery. All right, 1 Samuel 16, 6 through 7. And when they came I try to say came and king at the same time, and you got king, but no. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So Jesse and his sons arrive. Samuel looks at the oldest of Jesse's sons, which is Eliab, and thinks, surely this is the one. Eliab is probably 30 years older, so he's established in life. His appearance seems to be handsome and impressive to Samuel. But God reminds Samuel that God doesn't judge people based on their looks. He sees what's in their heart. And for whatever reason, Eliab doesn't make the cut. But Eliab is not Jesse's only son. He has 8. It's a lot. It's a lot of sons. So, 1 Samuel 16, 8 through 11. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Samuel said to Jesse, are all your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. Son after son, Jesse parades before Samuel. But each one, Samuel's like, nope, that's not the one. And finally, the 7th son, the last son, goes before Samuel. And Samuel's like, it's not him either. Are you sure all your sons are here? This is like that scene at the end of Cinderella where the prince is like, are you sure these are the only girls here? Surely Cinderella is in the kitchen, right? So Jesse didn't know, unlike the evil stepmother, that Samuel was going to pick a king from his sons. He just got an invitation from the prophet of God to come with his family to sacrifice to God. But the home front still needed someone to take care of it. So he left his youngest, who was probably a teenager, while the rest were adults, back at home to take care of the sheep. So he's like, yeah, all my important sons are here. After all, surely a prophet of God didn't need to see the youngest and, by law, least of Jesse's sons. But Samuel says to bring him. 1 Samuel 16, 12 through 13. He sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. The Lord said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. So the youngest son, who I don't think at this point has been named, but his name is David, is brought before Samuel. He's described as ruddy, which, if you remember, means red. We saw that word in the Jacob and Esau story. But it also basically means very handsome. Think of it as like having a healthy complexion, like red cheeks, right? Is what they would kind of think of. And God identifies that this boy is the one. He is the one who will be king. David, the least of Jesse's sons, who when Jesse one day dies as the youngest, would get the absolute smallest inheritance of all of his brothers, if he gets anything. David, who Jesse didn't think was important enough to come meet Samuel. David, a shepherd boy. This who is chosen to be king. This isn't the first time we've seen God choose the youngest son. Cain was the oldest. But God favored Abel. Ishmael was older, but it was Isaac who was chosen. Esau was the older brother, but it was Jacob that God chose to be the father of Israel. Joseph and Benjamin were both the youngest of Jacob's sons, but the most favored by Jacob. God constantly turns human expectations on their head. And it's no different here from David. The youngest of Jesse's sons is to be the one favored by God, the one who will be king. Will be, but not yet. Now, Saul is still king, right? Saul's like an adult with a whole army and all of Israel supporting him and backing him. How is this going to happen? Usually, when a king dies, his son becomes king after him. We've already met Saul's oldest son, Jonathan. So, yeah, there's a lot that's going to happen there. And we're going to start it with probably one of the most famous of the David stories, a story I know you guys all know, which is the story of David and Goliath, which is in the next chapter. 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 7. 1 Samuel 17, 1 through 7. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountains on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung across between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. All right, so we're still fighting the Philistines. Never ending. And the Philistines are at it again. They're gathering in the lands that belong to Israel, because remember, Judah is part of Israel. The Israelites obviously can't allow this, so they form an army as well, and these two armies are basically camped across from each other, staring each other down. Then this huge Philistine comes out, a man called Goliath. He's huge, he's super impressive, he has this great armor, he has a huge javelin. He's basically the scariest dude the Israelites have ever seen. They're scared out of their minds. 1 Samuel 17, 8 through 11. He, being Goliath, stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. And if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then he will be your servant. Then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man who may fight, that we may fight together." When Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. All right, so Goliath challenges the whole Israelite army, throwing down the proverbial gauntlet. He's basically like, we don't need a full-on battle. Just send out one champion. Trial by combat, yo. If he defeats me, we'll be your slaves. And if I win, you'll be our slaves. Seems like an okay deal, only risking one man's life instead of many, except Goliath is huge and terrifying. And there's no one in Israel even close to his stature. These men are shaking in their boots like, what the heck are we going to do? Yeah. And it's like, if this guy wins, they're hosed. So, next section, 1 Samuel 17, 12 through 16. Oh, I choked on my water. Went down the wrong pipe. All right, sorry guys. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem and Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, the next him Abinab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. Jesse said to his son David, "Take your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. All right, so 3 of David's older brothers are in this army, the army of Saul. David's dad, Jesse, is worried about his sons. So he basically donates food to the army. This would not be crazy. So today, when you think of like joining the army, right, you think of like mess halls and being fed, right? You're not going to not have food. But this is ancient times, right? So there wasn't always enough food to go around. And often, yes, if you wanted food, someone from your home might bring it to the army, right? You know, there's a saying that armies march on their stomachs, right? Which is all about having these supply lines. And back then, they didn't really have that kind of stuff figured out. So it'd be questionable if David's brothers might even get food or appropriate food if David and his father weren't bringing that food to him. So David's basically going back and forth, it says a couple of times, to feed his siblings, right? So he's taking care of the sheep, he's bringing food to the siblings. And this one time at the end here, you know, Jesse, who's their dad, gives David a bunch of food. He's like, take this to your brothers. Also take some cheese to the commander of the army. So, you know, your brothers will be taken care of. Only a minor bribe there, guys. But also, you know, just doing the right thing, feeding the whole army a little bit. So slightly ingratiating, slightly doing the right thing. So David leaves his sheep behind, takes the food, and goes to the battle, presumably just to feed his brothers, just to give this cheese away, and then come back. 1 Samuel 17:21 through 27. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with him, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites saying, have you seen the man who comes up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich the man who kills him, and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel. David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the army of the living God? The people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. So David drops off the food with basically a quartermaster, and, you know, that's probably the cheeses, and then goes to see his brothers, probably bringing them their lunch. And as he's talking to his brothers, just catching up, you know, like you do, Goliath steps out and gives a challenge. Everyone is terrified of Goliath, but also everybody's like talking about it. This is like the best gossip they've had in a while, right? They're like, whoever kills this dude, the king is going to be grateful to like forever, and will probably make him like a noble, basically. Give him one of his daughters, give him a bunch of money. It'll be great. And David is like, yeah, something should be done for whoever puts this dude in his place, because by going against us, he's going against the army of God. And the others agree and are like, yeah, whoever kills him will be amazing. But notice, despite this promise of awards, and despite like talking up, whoever does this is going to be so great, no one's exactly volunteering to do this. They're all just like, yeah, whoever does this is going to get such a reward. Sure hope somebody does it. Sure hope somebody who's not me. Somebody. Anybody. 1 Samuel 17:28 through 30. 1 Samuel 17:28 through 30. And his eldest brother Eliab heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you come down just to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? It was only a question. He turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. So David's older brother hears him talking. He's like, dude, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at home watching the sheep. Instead, you just want to see battle and glory. Stupid kid, go home. Notice that Eliab immediately jumps to the worst conclusion. We know that David was actually sent here by his father, that he has his father's permission to be away from the sheep, and that his father directly asked him to go check on his brothers. But a lot of us have siblings, and we know that we don't always give our siblings the benefit of a doubt. When we see them doing something, we assume they're not supposed to be doing. So Eliab is doing the age-old practice of yelling at a younger sibling as if he's the younger sibling's parent, when he is in fact not. This happens all the time. It happens today. Sometimes we think it's our job to yell at our younger siblings and discipline them for our parents. But Eliab is wrong here, which David points out. David has done nothing wrong. So David basically ignores Eliab, which probably makes him furious, and goes back to talking to the other dudes. Imagine if David had listened to Eliab and went home with his tail between his legs instead of doing what we know he's going to do, which is defeat Goliath. It's something for us to remember, right? We don't always know everything. And sometimes just because a person isn't where you think they're supposed to be doesn't mean they're not where God wants them to be. So, tread carefully, especially when it comes to our siblings. Which doesn't mean you can't advise your siblings. Doesn't mean you can't, try to protect them if they're in a situation that you think isn't safe. But you don't know everything. You don't know what's in your sibling's mind and heart. You don't know what your parents have told your sibling they can or cannot do. And so, we got to be careful. We are not our parents. We are not God. Our siblings are their own people. It's hard, but it's true. All right, 1 Samuel 17, 31 through 37. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him. You are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth, and if it turned against me, I could catch it by the jaw and strike it down and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of the Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul calls David, and David is like, "Don't worry, my king. I've got this. I'll fight him." Okay, you guys know that scene in Star Wars A New Hope where, they're all getting prepped for the Death Star battle, and good old Wedge Antilles, after they show how they have to shoot the thing, is like, "That's impossible." And Luke's like, "I used to shoot womp rats back home. That's no problem." And everyone just is like, "Kid, you've never even flown an X-Wing before. What's wrong with you?" David is the Luke Skywalker in this situation, right? He's like, "Oh, yeah, I shoot those womp rats all the time. They're like 2 meters, and, from my little T-34, 35, it's just like an X-Wing, right? Not a problem. I got this." And Saul's just like, "You're like a teenager. This is insane. This guy is a full-grown killing machine. He will cut you down like grass." But David is so confident in his own ability. But it's not just his own ability that he's confident in. You'll notice here, right? He's like, "God will protect me," right? These are the armies of the living God. God is not going to allow this. And it's not because I'm awesome that I took down the bears and the lions, but it's because that God was staying their paw. So God's got my back, and I can do this. He's, very confident. And to be fair to David, us modern people tend to think of being a shepherd as an easy gig, just chilling out with some sheep, maybe whistling at a dog. But things were different back then. It was a shepherd's job to protect the sheep from all sorts of animals who might threaten it. We often think of that as wolves, but that's a very British European kind of threat. In Israel, it seems that there were bears and probably like mountain lions who would also threaten the sheep. So David would have had to have learned how to fight to protect them. So he probably did fight a few animals. It's probably not just the claim of an overconfident teenage boy. On the other hand, Goliath is not a bear. But Saul basically gives him the okay. Saul's kind of like, whatever. Worst case scenario, you get killed, and then we just go to all out war, because there's no way I'm letting them enslave us. So 1 Samuel 17, 38 through 40. Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the army, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. with his sling in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So Saul doesn't want David out unprotected. You got to give this kid a chance. So he gives David his own armor, since David has none, being like a kid. So he gives him a bronze helmet, a chainmail coat, a huge sword, and David tries them all on and tries to walk in them, but Saul's like a full-grown man, old enough to have sons who are David's age and older. Saul is a warrior and a king who has led his people in many battles. David is a teenager. This stuff is way too big for him. And even when it's strapped down to size, David's just not used to moving in this stuff. It's like putting on football pads on someone who has never worn them before. Sure, they might protect him, but he can't move in it, so he's going to be dead anyway. So David removes the armor and instead takes a shepherd's weapon, his staff, 5 stones, and a sling. Now, when we say sling, I don't want you to think of a slingshot. These are not the same things. So often we imagine a slingshot when we think of David and Goliath and like this. That is not what's happening. This is not something where you create a projectile by pulling back and releasing it. This is more like a device where you put a rock in it and then you whip it around your head in a circle until it reaches the velocity you want. And then when you stop, it shoots the rock out. These are highly inaccurate weapons, generally speaking, but they can be deadly because you can put some big rocks in them. So when he talks about river rocks, I want you to think of those big xeriscaping rocks, not the little ones, like, big. So David goes before the Philistines like this, an unarmed boy. Needless to say, they're not impressed. But David is confident because he knows God's got his back. He's the anointed of God, by golly. So, let's see what happens. 1 Samuel 17, 48 through 51. 1 Samuel 17, 48 through 51. When the Philistines drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head with it. Yeah. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Even if David only seems like a boy, Goliath is still going to fight him. It is not his fault the Israelites sent someone wimpy looking to be their champion. So they face each other, and before they're even close enough for Goliath to be able to use his sword, David uses his sling, shoots out a rock, and hits Goliath in the head, knocking him out, or at least knocking him down, which is an impressive and impossible shot. Because remember, a sling is a very inaccurate weapon. So yes, David was skilled, but really without God, I find it highly unlikely he would have made such a shot. David then runs forward, takes Goliath's sword, and cuts off Goliath's head. Yeah. This causes the Philistines to run. But not only is their champion dead, but if such a small, wimpy boy could do it, how ruthless must the rest of the army be? That's a logical thought. 1 Samuel 17, 55 through 58. When Saul saw David go out against the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this young man?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." The king said, "Inquire whose son the stripling is." On David's return from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." David defeats Goliath, and Saul says to his commander, "Who is this kid?" And his commander is like, I really don't know. But they find out that he is the son of Jesse from Bethlehem. At this point, David has impressed all of Israel, including Saul. We'll see next week that Saul will be brought into his court, trusted by Saul, and becomes best friend with Saul's son and heir, Jonathan. But it doesn't last. Not the friendship, but the, peace with Saul. Because it turns out Saul doesn't like when his people view someone other than him as the hero of Israel. Because Saul's not thinking about God. He's not thinking about Israel. He's thinking about himself as king. Especially when Saul knows God no longer supports his position as king. Saul doesn't see that David is a threat yet, not here, but he quickly will. And this will begin a time that is not easy for anyone in Israel. So, that is today's lesson, David and Goliath. Oh, let me stop the recording.